June 3, 1942. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he gazed across the Pacific's deceptively calm waters. The morning sun cast long shadows across the massive fleet spread before him, the largest naval armada Japan had ever assembled. Yet beneath his composed exterior, a gnawing doubt ate at his confidence like rust on steel. The plan seemed flawless on paper. Operation MI would strike at Midway Atoll, that tiny speck of coral and sand that served as America's westernmost outpost in the Pacific. By forcing the remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle, Japan would crush American naval power once and for all, securing the empire's defensive perimeter and bringing the war to a swift conclusion. But Yamamoto knew better than most that no plan survived contact with the enemy. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who had helped orchestrate the Hawo, Pearl Harbor attack, approached with the latest intelligence reports. His usually confident demeanor showed cracks of concern as he briefed the admiral on their dispositions. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the heart of the striking force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's command. Supporting them were battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines in a complex multi-pronged assault that stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean. "The Americans cannot possibly match our strength," Genda reported, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Our intelligence suggests they have perhaps 2 carriers in the area, possibly 3 at most." What neither man knew was that their impenetrable naval codes had been broken months earlier by a team of American cryptographers working in the basement of a converted school building in Hawaii. According to declassified documents from the National Security Agency archives, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Haipo had been reading Japanese naval communications with startling clarity, providing Admiral Chester Nimitz with an unprecedented window into enemy intentions. The fundamental flaw in Japan's Midway vision wasn't merely tactical, it was philosophical. The operation attempted to serve too many masters simultaneously. While ostensibly designed to eliminate American carrier strength, it also aimed to capture Midway itself, create a diversion with a simultaneous attack on the Aleutian Islands, and potentially draw out the American fleet for annihilation. This complexity violated the cardinal military principle of maintaining focus on a single, achievable objective. As the Japanese fleet steamed eastward through the night, Yamamoto couldn't shake the feeling that they were sailing into a trap of their own making. The admiral who had warned against awakening a sleeping giant now found himself commanding an operation that epitomized everything he had feared about Japan's approach to the Pacific War: ambitious beyond reason, dependent on perfect timing, and fatally underestimating American resolve and capability. The die was cast, and within hours, the largest naval battle in Pacific history would begin to unfold in ways that none of the participants could have imagined. June 4, 1942. Dawn. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey checked his instruments aboard the aircraft carrier Enterprise. The American task force, designated Task Force 16 and 17, had positioned itself northeast of Midway based on intercepted Japanese communications that revealed the enemy's exact approach vector and timing. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 in place of the hospitalized Admiral William Bull Halsey, had spent the previous evening studying intelligence reports that seemed almost too good to be true. The Americans knew not only that the Japanese were coming, but precisely when and from which direction. They knew the composition of the enemy fleet, the timing of the planned airstrikes, and even the radio call signs Japanese pilots would use. This intelligence advantage represented the first critical flaw in Japan's Midway conception. The operation's success depended entirely on achieving tactical surprise, yet American codebreakers had stripped away that advantage weeks before the first shot was fired. Station Haipo's intercepts revealed that the Japanese planned to attack Midway at dawn, withdraw to refuel and rearm, then strike again when the American fleet arrived, a fleet they assumed would come steaming blindly into their trap. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, lay bedridden with appendicitis, unable to command the morning's airstrike. His replacement, Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, possessed skill, but lacked Fuchida's intuitive grasp of carrier operations. This seemingly minor personnel change would have cascading effects on Japanese timing and coordination throughout the battle. At 0430 hours, Nagumo launched his first wave against Midway, 108 aircraft carrying bombs and torpedoes toward the American base. The strike force lifted off in perfect formation, their engines roaring across the Pacific darkness as they began the 2-hour flight to their target. But Nagumo's force was already operating under constraints. That violated basic carrier doctrine. The admiral had been ordered to maintain half his aircraft armed for anti-ship operations in case American carriers appeared, while simultaneously mounting effective strikes against Midway's installations. This divided attention would prove catastrophic when split-second decisions became matters of survival. As dawn broke over Midway Atoll, radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation while it was still 70 miles away. Every available American fighter took to the air, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and a handful of newer Grumman Wildcats that would be hopelessly outnumbered, but determined to exact a price from the attackers. The Japanese strike achieved its tactical objectives, damaging fuel facilities and aircraft hangars while suppressing most of Midway's defensive capabilities. But Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, leading the attack, radioed back a message that would trigger the first fatal decision of the battle. There is need for a second attack wave. Upon receiving this communication, Nagumo faced the exact scenario his divided mission parameters had made inevitable. His reserve aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for use against ships, but Tominaga's assessment suggested he needed immediate land attack ordnance for a follow-up strike on Midway. The admiral's decision to rearm his reserve aircraft for a second land attack would leave him fatally vulnerable when American dive bombers arrived overhead, just as his flight decks were cluttered with bombs, fuel lines, and aircraft in various states of preparation. June 4, 1942, 0700 hours. The crackling radio message that changed everything reached Nagumo at exactly 0728 hours. Enemy fleet sighted bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stared at the message slip, his mind racing through calculations. That would determine the fate of the Japanese Empire. For months, he had been the most successful carrier commander in the world, leading the strikes that had devastated Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Rabaul, and Darwin. But now he faced a decision that would expose the fundamental contradiction built into Operation MI from its very conception. The scout plane report confirmed his worst fears. American carriers were indeed present in strength, positioned to threaten his force just as he was preparing for a second strike on Midway. The rigid operational plan that Tokyo had imposed allowed no flexibility for this contingency. Nagumo was expected to neutralize Midway's defenses while simultaneously maintaining readiness to engage enemy fleet units. But the realities of carrier operations made both objectives mutually exclusive. Commander Minoru Genda, still weak from a fever that had struck him during the approach, struggled to his feet to advise his admiral. The tactical situation was becoming a nightmare of competing priorities and compressed timelines. Half of Nagumo's aircraft were returning from the Midway strike, low on fuel and requiring immediate recovery. His reserve squadrons were caught in the middle of rearming operations, switching from anti-ship torpedoes to land attack bombs based on Tominaga's assessment. "Sir, we must decide immediately," Genda urged, his voice hoarse but urgent. "We cannot maintain this divided posture." The intelligence failure that would doom the Japanese force was not merely about codes and communications. It reflected a deeper misunderstanding of American industrial capacity and strategic thinking. Japanese planners had assumed that the devastating losses at Pearl Harbor would force American naval commanders into a defensive crouch, husbanding their remaining resources rather than risking them in offensive operations. They failed to comprehend that Admiral Nimitz would gamble everything on a single decisive battle, positioning his entire available carrier strength in a carefully orchestrated ambush. At 0745 hours, Nagumo made his fateful decision. He ordered the rearming operation to reverse course once again, switching his reserve aircraft back to anti-ship configuration to deal with the American fleet threat. This second reversal would consume precious time while leaving his carriers at their most vulnerable. Flight decks crowded with aircraft, ordnance, and fuel lines in a deadly configuration that turned each ship into a floating ammunition depot. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet, was already approaching the Japanese fleet from the southwest. His 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers flying low over the waves in outdated aircraft that were death traps against modern fighters. Waldron had broken radio discipline earlier that morning, telling his men, "If there's only one plane left to make a final run, I want that man to go in and get a hit." The Americans were operating under their own constraints and misconceptions. Their torpedo bombers were obsolete, their fighter coordination was poor, and their strike groups were launching piecemeal rather than in coordinated waves. But they possessed two crucial advantages. They knew exactly where their enemy was located, and they were willing to accept catastrophic losses to achieve their objective. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific, both fleets were converging on a point of contact that would determine whether Japan's Pacific Empire would expand further or begin its inexorable collapse. June 4, 1942, 09:00 hours the Tut. Sky above the Japanese fleet erupted in a maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire as Torpedo Squadron 8 began its attack run against the carrier Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Waldron's obsolete Devastators, flying barely 50 feet above the Pacific's surface, presented perfect targets for Japanese fighters and ship-based guns. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 American torpedo bombers were burning wrecks scattered across the ocean. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, clung to a life raft amid floating debris, watching the battle unfold from his unique vantage point in the water. His testimony would later provide crucial details about the Japanese fleet's disposition and the timing of subsequent attacks. But in that moment, he could only observe as his squadron's sacrifice seemed to achieve nothing. None of their torpedoes had found their mark. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, the scene was one of barely controlled chaos. Nagumo's repeated rearming orders had created exactly the situation that carrier doctrine warned against. Aircraft parked closely together on bow deck, fuel lines stretched between them, and ordnance scattered about in various stages of preparation. The ship's damage control officer, Commander Takahisa Amagai, watched with growing alarm as safety protocols were abandoned in the rush to ready the strike force. What American planners and the Japanese defenders both failed to fully appreciate was how the complexity of their respective operations was amplifying every small error into potential catastrophe. The Japanese plan required precise timing across multiple task forces, separated by hundreds of miles, while the American response demanded coordination between land-based aircraft from Midway and carrier-based planes operating from 3 different task forces. At 0920 hours, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise toward the Japanese carriers, his 14 aircraft, following the same low-altitude approach that had proven so deadly for Waldron's squadron. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, now numbering nearly 50 Zero fighters, fell upon the attackers with devastating efficiency. Within minutes, 10 of Lindsay's Devastators were shot down, and the remaining 4 scored no hits despite their crew's extraordinary courage. The morning's torpedo attacks were becoming a slaughter that seemed to validate every aspect of Japanese tactical superiority. Their fighters were faster and more maneuverable, their pilots more experienced, and their anti-aircraft defenses more effective than American intelligence had estimated. But the very success of these defensive actions was drawing Japanese fighters down to low altitude and depleting their ammunition reserves at precisely the moment when high-altitude defense would become critical. According to records maintained by the Naval Historical Center, the Japanese defensive success was creating a false sense of security aboard Nagumo's flagship. Radio intercepts suggested that American attacks were uncoordinated and ineffective, leading Japanese commanders to believe they had weathered the worst of the enemy response. This assessment would prove tragically premature. Commander Clarence McCluskey, leading Enterprise's bombing squadron, was at that moment lost over the empty Pacific, his fuel gauge dropping toward the point of no return as he searched for the Japanese fleet. His 37 dive bombers were supposed to coordinate with the torpedo attack, but communication failures and navigational errors had scattered the American strike groups across hundreds of square miles of ocean. The complexity that was supposed to ensure Japanese victory, multiple converging task forces, simultaneous operations across vast distances, intricate timing requirements, was instead creating vulnerabilities that neither side fully understood. As the battle entered its second phase, both fleets were about to discover how quickly tactical success could transform into strategic disaster. June 4th, 1942. 10:24 hours. Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey pushed his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber into a steep climb, desperately searching the Pacific for any sign of the Japanese fleet. His fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels, and in a few minutes he would have to choose between continuing the search and ensuring his squadron's safe return to Enterprise. Below him, 36 other dive bombers followed in loose formation, their crews scanning the empty ocean with growing frustration. Then, at exactly 10:22 hours, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward at maximum speed, leaving a distinctive white wake across the blue water. The destroyer Arashi had been delayed while conducting anti-submarine operations and was now desperately trying to rejoin the main fleet. In her haste to catch up, she had inadvertently created a perfect arrow pointing directly toward Nagumo's carriers. Aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, the morning's successful defense against American torpedo attacks had created a deceptive calm. Nagumo's staff was preparing to launch their own strike against the American carriers, with aircraft finely armed and spotted for takeoff. The flight deck was crowded with 36 attack planes, their engines warming up as pilots received final briefings. Fuel lines snaked between the aircraft, and ordnance carts stood ready with additional bombs and torpedoes. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, despite his illness, had insisted on observing the operations from Akagi's island superstructure. His experienced eye noted the dangerous congestion on the flight deck, but launch operations were already too far advanced to delay. The morning's defensive victory had consumed enormous quantities of ammunition and fuel while drawing fighters down to low altitude, but these concerns seemed secondary to the opportunity now presenting itself. At 10:24 hours, McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into a nearly vertical dive toward Akagi, beginning an attack that would last exactly 5 minutes and change the course of the Pacific War. Behind him, Lieutenant Dick Best led a section of bombers toward the carrier Akagi, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron from Yorktown attacked Soryu simultaneously. The timing was purely coincidental, the result of navigation errors and communication failures that had scattered American formations throughout the morning. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, having spent the morning at low altitude repelling torpedo attacks, was caught completely out of position. Most of the Zero fighters were either landing to refuel and rearm or still climbing back to operational altitude after the last defensive action. Those few fighters that were properly positioned found themselves overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of dive bombers attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. Fuchida watched in horror as the first American bomb struck Akagi's flight deck just forward of the midships elevator. The explosion ignited aviation fuel that had been spilled during the morning's rushed rearming operations, creating an instant inferno that spread rapidly among the closely packed aircraft. Within seconds, the carrier's entire forward flight deck was engulfed in flames that made firefighting impossible and trapped dozens of aircraft with their fuel tanks and ordnance loads. The scene was replicated across 3 other carriers as American dive bombers found their targets within the span of 5 minutes that Japanese naval historians would later call the fatal 5 minutes. Kaga took 4 direct hits that detonated her torpedo storage and aviation fuel supplies. Soryu suffered 3 bomb hits that started uncontrollable fires among her armed and fueled aircraft. Only Hiryu, operating several miles from the main formation, escaped the initial attack. What made these 5 minutes so devastating was not merely the accuracy of American bombing, but the vulnerable condition of the Japanese carriers. The morning's complex rearming operations had created exactly the conditions that carrier safety doctrine sought to prevent. Maximum fuel, maximum ordnance, and minimum damage control capability, all concentrated on exposed flight decks. The flaw in Japan's Midway vision was now fully exposed. The operation's complexity had created cascading vulnerabilities that turned tactical advantages into strategic disasters within minutes. June 4th, 1942, 1400 hours, Captain Tomeo Kaku stood on the bridge of the burning carrier Hiryu, the last operational flight deck in Admiral Nagumo's once mighty task force. Around him, the Pacific horizon was marked by 3 towering columns of black smoke where Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned out of control, their magazines detonating in thunderous explosions that could be heard 20 miles away. The morning's catastrophe had vindicated every doubt Admiral Yamamoto had harbored about Operation MI's fundamental design. The plan's fatal complexity had transformed Japan's greatest naval advantage, their experienced carrier pilots and superior aircraft, into a liability when those irreplaceable assets were concentrated aboard floating funeral pyres. Hiryu's air Group Commander, Lieutenant Commander Takashige Agusa, despite being wounded in the morning's attacks, prepared to launch the final Japanese strike of the battle. His 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters represented the last offensive capability, remaining to the Imperial Navy in the Central Pacific. Their target, the American carrier Yorktown, which reconnaissance flights had located northeast of the burning Japanese ships. At 1400 hours, Agusa's aircraft found Yorktown and pressed home their attack with the skill and determination that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. Their bombs struck the American carrier's flight deck and penetrated deep into her hull, starting fires and flooding that brought the ship to a dead stop. For a brief moment, it appeared that Japanese forces might salvage something from the disaster by eliminating at least one American carrier. But Yorktown's damage control teams, trained in techniques developed after careful study of British experiences in the Atlantic, quickly brought the fires under control and restored partial power. Within 2 hours, the carrier was making 20 knots and operating aircraft again, a recovery that seemed impossible to Japanese observers accustomed to their own navy's less sophisticated damage control procedures. The afternoon brought Hiryu's own doom when American dive bombers from Enterprise located the last Japanese carrier. At 1700 hours, Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 24 dauntless bombers in a textbook attack that left Hiryu as helplessly ablaze as her sister ships. Captain Kaku, realizing his ship was doomed, ordered the Emperor's portrait transferred to a destroyer before beginning preparations to scuttle the vessel. As darkness fell over the Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto aboard the battleship, Yamato faced the wreckage of his carefully crafted strategy. 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers lay burning or sunk, along with most of their experienced aircrew, men who had participated in every major Japanese victory since Pearl Harbor. The loss represented not merely a tactical defeat, but the beginning of Japan's inevitable retreat across the Pacific. The intelligence reports reaching Yamamoto's flagship painted a grim picture of American industrial capacity that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated. According to captured documents analyzed by naval intelligence, American shipyards were already constructing dozens of new carriers using mass production techniques that would allow them to replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. In the quiet of his cabin that night, Yamamoto composed a message to Imperial Navy headquarters that acknowledged the reality his subordinates were reluctant to report. The enemy's fighting strength is far greater than we had calculated. Our losses are severe, and the strategic situation has fundamentally changed. The Battle of Midway had exposed the central contradiction in Japan's Pacific strategy. The empire lacked the industrial base to sustain a prolonged war against American production capacity. Yet their military doctrine demanded ever more ambitious operations that stretched resources beyond their breaking point. The flawed vision that conceived Operation MI as a decisive stroke had instead accelerated Japan's path toward defeat. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, it marked not only the end of a battle, but the beginning of Japan's long retreat toward ultimate surrender. The empire that had sought to rule the Pacific would spend the next 3 years learning the price of strategic overreach and tactical complexity that exceeded their ability to execute.